The morning of May 5th, 1945, broke gray and cold over the southern end of Okinawa. Private First Class Desmond Thomas Doss crouched at the base of the Maeda Escarpment, a 400-foot wall of jagged rock and scrub that the men of the 77th Infantry Division had come to call Hacksaw Ridge. Around him, soldiers from Company B of the 1st Battalion, 307th Infantry Regiment were checking weapons, adjusting their gear, saying the quiet, private things men say before they climb toward a place that has already killed many of them. Doss was not checking a weapon. He had none. What he carried was a first aid kit, a canteen, 2 morphine syrettes in his breast pocket, and a small Bible his wife Dorothy had given him before he shipped out. He was 26 years old. He weighed less than 150 pounds. And in a few hours, he would do something that his own commanding officers would later struggle to describe in official language without making it sound like a thing that could not have happened. The Army citation would eventually say that he saved 75 men. The men who were there said the number was higher. One Japanese survivor of the battle later stated that he had aimed his rifle directly at Doss more than once, and that his weapon had jammed each time. Whether that was providence or coincidence depended on what a man believed. What was beyond dispute was this. When the last American soldier who could still walk retreated down the cargo nets and left the top of the Maeda Escarpment, Desmond Doss stayed behind. He stayed behind with the wounded. He stayed behind unarmed, alone, on a plateau crawling with Japanese infantry who had just driven an entire American battalion off of it. And he crossed that open ground 11 times, dragging men to the edge of the cliff and lowering them one by one, asking the same prayer between each trip. Lord, help me get just one more. This is the story of how a man who refused to kill became the first conscientious objector in American history to receive the Medal of Honor. But to understand what he did on that ridge, you have to understand the world that made him. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Desmond Thomas Doss was born on February 7th, 1919, in Lynchburg, Virginia, the middle child of William and Bertha Doss. His father was a carpenter, a World War I veteran who had come back from France carrying wounds that never showed on his skin. The Depression hit the family hard. They were not poor in a way that breaks people immediately, but rather in the way that grinds them down slowly, meal by careful meal, winter by careful winter. What kept the Doss household together, in the estimation of those who knew it, was Bertha. She was a Seventh-day Adventist, a woman of quiet, immovable faith, and she raised her children inside that faith the way a good carpenter builds a house, with care for the joints, for the things that hold. On one wall of the family home hung a framed picture that William had purchased at an auction. It was a large illustrated rendering of the 10 Commandments. Each commandment had a small drawing beside it. The 6th commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," was illustrated with a figure of Cain standing over his brother Abel, a club in his hand. Abel motionless on the ground beneath him. The young Desmond would stand in front of that picture and stare at it. He could not understand it. He would ask his mother how a brother could do such a thing to his own brother. The answer she gave him was the one her faith gave, that the commandment was not a suggestion, not a guideline for ordinary times only. It was a covenant. If you love me, you will not kill. That picture would travel with Desmond Doss across 26 years of his life, from that house in Lynchburg to a barracks at Fort Jackson to the fire-swept plateau of a cliff in the Ryukyu Islands. It would be the fixed point around which everything else revolved. The world Desmond grew up in was not a gentle one. His father, the way of the war and the Depression pressing on him in ways he could not articulate, drank. There were evenings in the Doss house when the tension reached a breaking point. The defining incident happened during a confrontation between William and an uncle. William pulled a gun. Bertha stepped between them, demanded the weapon, and handed it to young Desmond, telling him to run and hide it. He ran. He hid it. And standing there in the dark, holding a gun that had nearly been used to kill a member of his own family, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would never hold a gun again. He was a teenager when Pearl Harbor was attacked. He was 22, working at the Newport News Naval Shipyard in Virginia, when the draft notices began moving to the country like a tide. His work at the shipyard made him eligible for a deferment. He was building things the Navy needed. He could have stayed. He chose not to. He believed in the cause of the war. He believed that fascism was a genuine evil that had to be stopped by men willing to put themselves in its path. He simply also believed with equal certainty that he himself would not kill to stop it. He would serve. He would carry no gun. He enlisted on April 1st, 1942, at Camp Lee, Virginia. He was assigned to the reactivated 77th Infantry Division and sent to Fort Jackson, South Carolina for basic training. What happened there was not subtle. The men of his barracks regarded him from the first day as something between a fool and a liability. He would not touch a rifle. He would not train on Saturday, which as a Seventh-day Adventist he observed as a Sabbath. He knelt beside his bunk at night to pray, and men threw their boots at him while he knelt. They called him Holy Joe. They called him a coward. One soldier told him directly, with considerable force, that when they reached combat, he planned to shoot Doss himself rather than be slowed down by a man who would not fight. As Doss later said in a documentary about his life, he was a joke. They made fun of him. They made him miserable in the particular way that men can make another man miserable when they have decided he does not deserve to be among them. His commanding officer, Captain Jack Glover, attempted to have him discharged on psychiatric grounds under a Section 8 evaluation. The Army reviewed the case and rejected it. Then Glover threatened court-martial if Doss refused to pick up a rifle. Doss told his captain that his classification as a conscientious objector was his file, that he was not required to handle a weapon, and that he intended to continue serving as a medic. A fellow soldier's intervention and the intervention of a church official in Washington, a man named Carlisle B. Haynes, chairman of the Seventh-day Adventist War Service Commission, ultimately helped resolve the legal question in Doss's favor. The Army retained him. He graduated training as a company aide man, medic classified, assigned to the medical detachment of the 307th Infantry Regiment, Company B. He shipped out to the Pacific in 1944. He still had no gun. The 77th Infantry Division landed on Guam in July of 1944. The jungle fighting there was close and merciless. Japanese defensive positions were woven to the terrain in ways that maps could not fully capture. Men went down in the undergrowth and lay there, and the men who could still walk had to decide, under fire, whether to advance or to drag them. Doss made no such calculation. He simply went to the wounded. Every time, he moved under fire without a weapon, and he treated men's injuries and dragged them to safety. And he did this again and again until soldiers who had been prepared to despise him began to reconsider what they were looking at. The Army awarded him a Bronze Star for valor. After Guam, the 307 fought on Leyte in the Philippines, where Doss earned a second Bronze Star. He contracted tuberculosis on Leyte, though he did not know it yet. The disease was growing quietly in his lungs while he continued to work. By the time the 77th Infantry Division reached Okinawa in late April of 1945, Desmond Doss had already demonstrated, in 2 separate campaigns, precisely who he was. The men of his unit knew it. The casual contempt of the barracks at Fort Jackson had been replaced by something that veterans of Pacific infantry fighting do not easily manufacture: genuine respect. When they climbed the cargo nets up the Maida Escarpment on May 2nd, 1945, the men of Company B did not worry about their medic. They worried about the Japanese. Okinawa was the last major island in the chain between the Allied advance and the Japanese home islands. American planners understood it as the staging ground for Operation Downfall, the projected invasion of Kyushu, the southernmost of Japan's main islands. Military estimates of casualties for that invasion ran to the hundreds of thousands on the American side alone, and potentially millions of Japanese dead. Okinawa was not simply another objective on a campaign map. It was a hinge on which the entire final phase of the war in the Pacific turned. The Japanese High Command understood this equally well. General Mitsuru Ushijima had prepared his defenses on Okinawa with meticulous care over years, not months. The island's terrain, particularly its southern portion, was a defender's terrain: ridges, escarpments, ravines, and network of tunnels and caves that honeycombed the rock beneath the surface. Ushijima had approximately 100,000 troops, and he did not intend to spend them on the beaches. He would pull the Americans into the island's interior, where the terrain and his fortifications would do the killing for him. The Maida Escarpment was one of those fortifications, a 400-foot ridge stretching across the island. its face nearly vertical in sections. It sat astride the American axis of advance toward Shuri, the ancient castle at the center of Japanese resistance. The top of the escarpment gave any defending force an unobstructed view across the approaches from the north. Japanese machine gun positions, mortar pits, and artillery observers had been installed there over months of preparation. Connecting them was a tunnel network that allowed troops and supplies to move beneath the surface, invisible to American air power, out of reach of direct fire weapons. The Americans had to take it. There was no route around it that did not surrender the initiative and allow Japanese forces to concentrate against the flanks of the advance. The only way through was up. The first American companies to reach the top of the escarpment in late April had paid for the climb in blood. Japanese machine gun fire was so intense that one account recorded a soldier being struck and killed before he had fully cleared the lip of the cliff. Company A of the 1st Battalion was nearly annihilated in the initial assault. The replacement of Company A by the remaining forces, including Company B with Desmond Doss, came on May 2nd. The cargo nets they used to scale the final 30 to 50 feet of the overhang, the section where the cliff face actually curved back toward the top, with the same nets that had been rigged by engineers under fire. Doss climbed those nets in the dark, his first aid kit on his back, his Bible in his breast pocket, and not a single weapon on his person. The men around him carried M1 Garand rifles, Thompson submachine guns, Browning automatic rifles, and satchels of hand grenades. They went up in silence and took their positions in the shell-cratered ground at the top of the ridge. And for the next several days, they held what they had taken, fighting against Japanese counterattacks from the tunnel network beneath them, from firing positions that materialized without warning, from grenades lobbed over low-lying cover at distances of 20 and 30 feet. Doss worked through those days constantly. His citation would later enumerate individual actions with the procedural precision of military documentation, and each line of that enumeration represented hours of movement across ground that was being swept by fire. On May 2nd, he exposed himself to heavy rifle and mortar fire to rescue a wounded man who had been hit 200 yards forward of the American line. 2 days later, he treated 4 men who had been cut down during an assault on a heavily defended cave, crawling through a barrage of Japanese grenades to reach them. Each one of these acts was the kind of thing that, described in isolation, would seem like the action of a man who had perhaps made an error in his self-preservation instincts. Repeated across days, they began to look like something else, like a man operating under a different logic entirely, one that had no category for self-preservation as a priority. What Doss believed was straightforward, and he stated it in the plainest terms he could find. He believed that God had placed him in that uniform and on that island specifically to save lives, and that as long as he was doing that work, God would not let him be killed. This was not fatalism. It was not the numb resignation of a man who has given up on survival. It was, in Doss's own understanding, a kind of contract, an agreement between himself and the divine that carried with the same certainty he had applied to every other conviction in his life. He had refused to carry a gun, and the army had tried everything it possessed to break that refusal, and it had not broken. He had crossed 2 Pacific battlefields, unarmed, and come back each time. The contract, as he understood it, was still in force. On the morning of May 5th, the Japanese counterattack came with a force that overwhelmed the forward American positions. Artillery, mortars, and machine gun fire struck the plateau with a sudden, coordinated intensity that the accounts of survivors struggled to convey in ordinary language. Japanese soldiers swarmed from their tunnel entrances and cave positions across the escarpment. Within minutes, approximately 75 American soldiers were down, wounded, in varying degrees of severity, scattered across open ground. The men who could still move began pulling back to the edge of the escarpment. Orders were given. The Americans would fall back down the cargo nets and regroup at the base. Every man who could move was to withdraw immediately. Every man except one. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The retreat took the better part of an hour. When it was complete, when the last American soldier who could still climb had made it down the cargo nets and the sound of pursuit had faded, the top of the mighty escarpment held only the Japanese, the dead, and the men who could not move on their own. And Desmond Doss, who had not retreated, who was already moving among the wounded, assessing injuries, applying dressings, preparing the bodies of men who were still breathing to be moved. Alone, unarmed, on 400 feet of cliff top that the Japanese now controlled, he found a tree stump near the edge of the escarpment. He fashioned a rope into a lowering harness, a loop sling that could support the weight of an unconscious man and be guided down the cliff face, and tied the working end of the rope around the stump. The system was improvised, built from whatever materials were at hand on that plateau. It was not elegant. What it was functional. He found the nearest wounded man. He applied what treatment the man's injuries required. He dragged him across open ground, over rocky, crater-pocked earth, toward the edge of the cliff. The average American combat infantryman at that stage of the war weighed around 160 to 170 pounds in his equipment. Doss weighed less than that himself, and he was pulling the full weight of a man who could not assist with the movement. He got him to the edge. He loaded him into the rope harness. He lowered him down. Then he went back. He found the next man. He treated him. He dragged him. He lowered him. He went back. He did this for 5 hours. The Japanese were on that plateau. They were moving through it. One Japanese soldier who survived the battle would state afterward that he had aimed his weapon at Doss on more than one occasion, and that something had prevented him from firing. In one version of the account, his rifle jammed. In another, he simply found he could not pull the trigger. The historical record does not fully resolve this detail. What the record does show, from after-action reports and the testimony of officers who later reconstructed the action, is that Doss moved across that fire-swept plateau repeatedly and was not killed. Whatever the reason, he kept moving. Between each trip, he prayed the same prayer. Lord, help me get just one more. The prayer was not a dramatic plea. It was a working request made by a man who had a task complete and was asking for the resources to continue it. He said it each time he reached the edge of the cliff and turned back toward the interior of the plateau. He said it with the matter-of-fact quality of a man making a practical calculation. He had one more person to retrieve. He needed help to get back. He asked for it. Then he went. By the time the light began to change in the late afternoon, and Doss finally descended from the plateau himself, the testimony of the men at the base of the cliff had already begun to accumulate. Officers and soldiers alike had watched a single unarmed figure moving at the top of the escarpment, crossing the open ground, appearing at the edge, lowering a man down, disappearing back into the interior. Again, the count, assembled after the fact from the testimony of the men who had been lowered and the men who had watched from below, was settled at 75 for the purposes of his Medal of Honor citation. Those who were there believed the real number was higher. The citation, drafted in the formal language of military documentation, described what Doss had done in these terms. He had refused to seek cover and remained in the fire-swept area with the wounded, carrying them one by one to the edge of the escarpment and lowering them on a rope-supported litter down the face of a cliff to friendly hands. The language was correct. It was also, in the way that official language often is, a reduction. It described the actions without quite being able to account for the man. What it could not fully capture was the detail of those 5 hours, the weight of each man, the distance from the center of the plateau to the edge, the physical accumulation of doing the same exhausting thing 11 times across open ground that was controlled by the enemy. It could not capture the silence in which Doss worked, the absence of shouts and gunfire that usually accompanied the moments of greatest danger in that war. It could not capture the single prayer, repeated between each trip, by a man who understood exactly what he was doing and had decided that he would keep doing it until he ran out of men to save. He came down from the ridge in the late afternoon of May 5th, 1945, and the men at the base of the Maida escarpment who had watched him work did not immediately know what to say. There is a particular silence that falls over combat soldiers when they have witnessed something they cannot quite categorize. Not the silence of grief, not the silence of celebration, but the silence of men recalibrating their understanding of what is possible. The soldiers of Company B stood at the bottom of the cargo nets and looked at Desmond Doss, and for a long moment nobody spoke. He was not triumphant. He was not dramatic. He was, by the accounts of those who were there, simply tired. A small, thin man in a filthy uniform who had just spent 5 hours dragging other men across a plateau controlled by the enemy, and who now sat down and ate what food was available and said very little. He would have been back up the nets within the hour if his commanding officers had allowed it. They did not allow it. They told him to rest. He rested. The next morning, before first light, he was already preparing to go back up. The fighting on and around the Maida escarpment did not end on May 5th. The Japanese still held the tunnel network beneath the plateau and the fortified positions on its reverse slope. American forces continued to assault the ridge throughout May, falling back, regrouping, climbing again. The logic of the battle was the same logic it had always been. There was no other way through. The only route to the Shuri line ran over that ridge, and the men of the 307th climbed it again and again, carrying their dead and their wounded down the same cargo nets on the way back. Doss was with them for all of it. His citation documents act spread across the entire period. The rescue under mortar fire, the treatment of men wounded in the assault on the cave position, the night patrols where he moved through darkness to reach men who had been hit and could not call out. He had been a medic through Guam and Leyte and the early days of Okinawa, and he moved now with the particular efficiency of a man who has done this so many times that the mechanics of it, the assessment, the dressing, the decision about whether to treat in place or move, had become as natural as breathing. What had not become natural, and what would never become natural, was the experience of watching men die. Doss spoke about this in interviews conducted decades after the war, and what comes through in those interviews is not the hardened numbness that popular imagination often assigns to combat veterans. It is something closer to the opposite, a persistent, undefended grief. He remembered the men he could not say with the same clarity. He remembered the ones he had carried to the nets. He did not compartmentalize. He had been raised in a faith that regarded every human life as a covenant, as something that belonged to God and was held only temporarily by men, and that framework did not permit the use of fiction that some deaths mattered less than others. On May 21st, 1945, Desmond Doss was wounded for the first time. He had gone forward with patrol near the Shuri line to help reach wounded men who had been left in the open during a firefight. He was treating a casualty when a grenade landed nearby. He was thrown by the blast. He took fragments in his legs, multiple wounds, none immediately life-threatening, but serious enough that he could not walk under his own power. Rather than call for aid and direct attention and fire toward his position, he treated his own wounds as best he could and waited approximately 5 hours in the open before he was found by a stretcher party. During those 5 hours, another casualty was brought near him on the stretcher. Doss, who had just had grenade fragments removed from his own legs, gave up his spot on the stretcher so the other man could be evacuated first. He remained in the open. When the stretcher party finally returned for him, they were carrying him back toward the aid station when a sniper opened fire. Doss rolled off the stretcher, told the bearers to take cover, and using a rifle he found on the ground as a crutch. The first time he had touched a rifle in his military service, he crawled 300 yards under fire to the aid station on his own. He got there. He was evacuated to a hospital ship. The doctors found, along with the grenade wounds, evidence of the tuberculosis that had been growing in his lungs since Leyte. He was 26 years old. He had 2 Bronze Stars. He had just spent the last 3 weeks on one of the bloodiest ridgelines in the Pacific War, and he was carrying a disease in his body that would take 5 years of treatment before it was fully resolved. The Medal of Honor is the United States' highest military decoration. It is awarded by the President in the name of Congress. The criteria, as they have existed since the Civil War, require that the recipient display gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty while engaged with an enemy of the United States. The standard is designed to be nearly impossible to meet, which is why the number of living Medal of Honor recipients at any given time is small enough that they can assemble in a single room. The process of nominating Desmond Doss began with the men who had watched him work. His immediate commanding officer, the same Captain Jack Glover who had once tried to have him discharged on psychiatric grounds, was among those who submitted testimony. By the time the documentation moved through the chain of command, from battalion to regiment to division to 6th Army, there was no disagreement about what had happened on the Maida escarpment on May 5th, only about what number to attach to it. The official citation settled on 75. The men who were there believed it was more. President Harry S. Truman presented Desmond Doss with a Medal of Honor at the White House on October 12, 1945. Doss arrived at the ceremony on crutches, still recovering from his wounds. He was in uniform, with his bronze stars already on his chest, and he carried himself with the same quality that everyone who met him in those years described: a quiet, undemonstrative steadiness, a sense that the thing he had done was simply the thing that had needed to be done, and that the ceremony, though he was grateful for it, did not quite capture what he wanted to say about it. Truman reportedly told him, as he placed a medal around his neck, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." Whether Truman actually said those words or something like them, the accounts differ slightly. What is consistent across all accounts of the ceremony is Doss's response, which was characteristic. He thanked the president, he accepted the medal, and he asked almost immediately about the condition of the men who had been wounded alongside him. He went home to Lynchburg, Virginia, and to Dorothy. They had been married in August of 1942. 3 months after he enlisted, at a ceremony he had to obtain a special pass from his commanding officer to attend. She had given him the Bible he carried through the entire Pacific campaign, a small volume that now had 3 years of Pacific humidity and 2 years of combat sweat worked into its cover. They had written letters throughout the war, and the letters, fragments of which survive, have the quality of two people trying to maintain the ordinary texture of a life across an ocean, and a war that made ordinary texture impossible. Dorothy had her own faith, her own understanding of the covenant her husband had made with himself and with God. She had not tried to talk him out of enlisting. She had not suggested, even obliquely, that a conscientious objector was perhaps not the most practical thing to be in a world at war. She believed what he believed. She had waited while he was in the Pacific, and she had prayed the same prayer he had prayed on the ridge, and she had not been surprised, had not, in some fundamental sense, been capable of surprise when he came home. They settled in Rising Fawn, Georgia, and later in Lookout Mountain. They had a son, Desmond Jr. The tuberculosis treatment was long and difficult. Doss spent parts of 5 years in medical facilities and left him with a permanent loss of 1 lung and significant hearing damage from the drugs used to treat the disease. He was declared legally deaf in 1976. He spent his later years farming, speaking at Seventh-day Adventist churches and civic events, and responding to the letters that continued to come from veterans and their families for the rest of his life. Dorothy died in November of 1991 after 50 years of marriage. It is worth pausing on that number. 50 years of a marriage that had begun in the shadow of a war, that had survived separation and combat and tuberculosis and disability. Desmond Doss was 72 when she died. He remarried in 1993 to a woman named Frances Duman. He gave interviews. He appeared in documentaries. He was a subject of a feature-length documentary, The Conscientious Objector, released in 2004, which gave him the opportunity to speak at length about the things he had spent 60 years being asked about. He spoke without bitterness about the men who had thrown boots at him in the barracks at Fort Jackson. He spoke without grandeur about what he had done on the ridge. When pressed on the question of fear, because journalists and documentary filmmakers always press on the question of fear, he answered with a precision that had clearly been arrived at over decades of reflection. He had been afraid, he said. He had always been afraid. Being afraid was not the same as being stopped. And besides, he said, with a quality in his voice that those who interviewed him consistently described as simply matter-of-fact, he had the feeling that as long as he was doing what he was supposed to be doing, he would be all right. The contract. He had believed in the contract. Mel Gibson's film Hacksaw Ridge was released in October of 2016, 11 years after Doss died. Gibson had been trying to make the film for nearly 15 years, having first encountered the story in the early 2000s and recognizing it's something that had particular cinematic sensibility. Its preoccupation with suffering and faith and the body pushed to its physical limits was suited to explore. The film won 2 Academy Awards, including Best Film Editing. Andrew Garfield, who played Doss, received a nomination for Best Actor. The film was a box office success and introduced the story of Desmond Doss to an audience of tens of millions who had not previously encountered it. The film compresses, dramatizes, and in several instances departs from the historical record. This is the nature of biographical filmmaking and not, in itself, a criticism. What it captures, and what the best critics of it recognized, is the essential strangeness of the thing Doss did, which is not reducible to bravery in the conventional sense. Bravery, in the usual telling, is a suppression of fear in the service of action. What Doss possessed was something more structurally unusual, a set of convictions so deeply integrated into his identity that they were not experienced as choices in the moment of action, but simply as the conditions of who he was. He did not go back across the plateau 11 times because he suppressed his fear each time. He went back because in the logic of his own life, going back was simply what came next. Desmond Doss died on March 23, 2005, at his home in Piedmont, Alabama. He was 87 years old. He had outlived most of the men of Company B, outlived Dorothy, outlived the better part of a century that had passed from the Depression-era Lynchburger's childhood to a world he would have found in many respects unrecognizable. He was buried at the Chattanooga National Cemetery in Tennessee, with military honors. The Medal of Honor he received in 1945 is on display at the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The Bible Dorothy gave him, the one that traveled from Lynchburg to Fort Jackson to Guam to Leyte to the Maida Escarpment and back, is preserved by his family. The framed picture of the Ten Commandments that hung on the wall of the house in Lynchburg, with Cain standing over Abel, is no longer locatable, though its image was reconstructed for the documentary from Doss's own description. It was by all accounts an ordinary picture, a mass-produced illustration, purchased at an auction by a man named William Doss sometime in the 1920s, hung on a wall where a child could see it, the kind of thing that accumulates in houses, and usually means nothing at all. A boy stood in front of it and stared at it, and asked his mother how a brother could do such a thing to his own brother, and she gave him an answer, and he believed the answer, and the belief became the fixed point around which everything else revolved. There is no adequate framework for accounting for how the particular arrangement of one family, one house, one picture on one wall, one woman's faith, one man's haunted silence, and one boy's particular mind produced what it produced. History does not move in straight lines from causes to effects. People are not the sum of their circumstances. What we can say is that on May 5th, 1945, on a cliff above a burning island in a war that was still killing people at industrial scale, a man who had decided at some early point that he would not kill crossed open ground 11 times to save the lives of men he loved, asking between each crossing for the help to make one more trip. He got the help. He made the trips. The men came down from the ridge. Here is an expanded final section, with approximately 500 additional words woven into the closing. Desmond Doss died on March 23, 2005, at his home in Piedmont, Alabama. He was 87 years old. He had outlived most of the men of Company B, outlived Dorothy, outlived the better part of a century that had passed from the Depression-era Lynchburger's childhood to a world he would have found in many respects unrecognizable. He was buried at the Chattanooga National Cemetery in Tennessee, with military honors. A contingent of Seventh-day Adventist church members attended, as did veterans groups and representatives from the Army. There were flowers and a flag and the precise folded geometry of a military burial, rituals designed to translate a life into something portable, something that can be carried by those left behind. Frances, his second wife, received the flag. His son Desmond Jr. was there. The men who had known him longest said afterward that the ceremony was fitting, but that no ceremony could quite hold what needed to be held. The Medal of Honor he received in 1945 is on display at the National Museum of the United States Army at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The Bible Dorothy gave him, the one that traveled from Lynchburg to Fort Jackson to Guam to Leyte to the Maida Escarpment and back, is preserved by his family. The framed picture of the Ten Commandments that hung on the wall of the house in Lynchburg, with Cain standing over Abel, is no longer locatable, though its image was reconstructed for the documentary from Doss's own description. It was, by all accounts, an ordinary picture, a mass-produced illustration, purchased at an auction by a man named William Doss sometime in the 1920s, hung on a wall where a child could see it, the kind of thing that accumulates in houses and usually means nothing at all. But a boy stood in front of it and stared at it. He stood there long enough and often enough that the image settled into something deeper than memory, into the bedrock of identity, the straight and below argument, below strategy, below the calculations men make in the moments when everything is at stake. He asked his mother how a brother could do such a thing to his own brother, and she gave him an answer rooted in her faith, and he took that answer and tested it against a world that offered him, over the course of 26 years, every reason to abandon it. The Army tested it. The barracks at Fort Jackson tested it. The men who threw boots and called him Holy Joe tested it. Captain Glover, with his psychiatric evaluations and his court-martial threats, tested it. The beaches of Guam tested it. The jungles of Leyte tested it. The Mayada Escarpment on the morning of May 5, 1945, tested it in the most absolute way a thing could be tested, with the full weight of death on one side of the scale. And it held. This is perhaps the most difficult thing to convey about Desmond Doss, and the thing that biographical films and military citations and documentary interviews all circle without quite landing on. His courage was not situational. It did not arise in the moment from some reservoir of adrenaline or martial spirit that circumstances had unlocked. It was structural. It was a load-bearing wall of self that had been built, timber by timber, from childhood forward, and that stood because every joint had been fitted with care, the way his father, whatever his failings, had taught him that a good carpenter builds. He had been told, in various ways, throughout his life that his convictions were incompatible with the world as it actually functioned, that a man could not go to war without a weapon, that faith without pragmatism was not courage but naivety, that the Sixth Commandment, however sincerely held, was not a principle that the Mayada Escarpment would accommodate. He was told these things by educated men, by men of rank and authority, by men who had themselves seen what war does to the body and who had arrived, through hard experience, at the conclusion that survival required a certain ruthlessness. He listened, he understood, and he went back up the nets anyway. There is a version of Desmond Doss's story that turns him into a symbol, into the living proof of some lesson about faith or courage or the transcendence of violence. The problem with that version is that it is too clean. It transforms a specific, complicated, unglamorous human being into an argument, and arguments do not sweat for 5 hours on a plateau, dragging men who cannot help themselves toward the edge of a cliff. What actually happened was messier and truer and stranger than any argument. A boy from Lynchburg who was afraid of guns and believed in the Sixth Commandment and loved his wife and prayed beside his bunk, while other men threw boots at him, crossed a fire-swept plateau 11 times because the men lying on it needed someone to comfort them, and he was the only person who stayed. He asked between each crossing for the help to make one more trip. He received it, or he generated it himself, or both. And the distinction, finally, may not matter as much as a fact. There is no adequate framework for accounting for how the particular arrangement of one family, one house, one picture on one wall, one woman's faith, one man's haunted silence, and one boy's particular mind produced what it produced. History does not move in straight lines from causes to effects. People are not the sum of their circumstances. What we can say is this. On May 5, 1945, on a cliff above a burning island in a war that was still killing people at industrial scale, a man who had decided at some early point that he would not kill crossed open ground 11 times to save the lives of men he loved, asking between each crosser for the help to make one more trip. He got the help. He made the trips. The men came down from the ridge. That is what happened. It is enough. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.